Hello class! Today we're going to be talking about the brain and neurons. Neurons are the functional unit of our nervous system. So our brain, what do you know about our brain? I'm sure a lot of you realize that your brain is responsible for who you are. I know when it comes to the escapades of love, we like to say follow your heart. That's horrible advice. Your heart does not do any of your higher order thinking. Follow this up here. Now, what does your brain do exactly? Well, we've talked a bit about it already. We've talked about how specific hormones will regulate our fluid balance in our body, for example, the pH of our blood, all of these different factors. And these glands in our brain that produce these hormones are absolutely essential, and they need to be functioning correctly. What else does our brain do? Well, it controls our ability to be creative, to think. It controls our sense of self, our emotions, our emotional interpretations, the way our body moves in space, our control over our body. It does everything that is you. So much so that we could literally chop off your head, put it on another body, and everything that is you would still be you. So let's talk a bit more about the brain. First up, we have the frontal lobe here, and the frontal lobe is what's responsible for your higher order thinking, problem solving, creativity, and those things. And it is the largest part of the brain. Now, keep in mind here, I'm going to give you a fairly simplistic overview. All of these parts of the brain have a ton of different functions, but we're just going to delve into maybe some of the unique ones or some of the major ones. And what's the major ones here? Well, it is responsible for thinking and creativity. It's part of the reason why our species has been so successful. We have an exceptionally large frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex, frontal lobe. This has given us a huge advantage. This is our hidden skill, intelligence, right? We have a very, very large brain in relation to our bodies. Kind of sucks for women though, because we have very large heads, and unfortunately does lead to a lot of death in childbirth. Now, this right here is your parietal lobe, and this is mainly controlling memory of objects, their uses, and sense of direction. So your parietal lobe has a heavy role to play in those aspects. Now, right at the median here, where these parietal lobe and frontal lobe meet, you have the motor area, sensory area. Again, most of your senses are going to be processed in that area, with the exception of a few. And for your control, conscious control over body movement, some of that processing is happening here in your prefrontal cortex, right there. Next up is your temporal lobe, and this is responsible for control of hearing, speech, and memory. If you get damage to this area, you could actually not be able to speak, but be able to formulate perfectly within your mind what you want to say. There are those individuals that have lost that ability to speak. If you think about it, speaking is a fairly complex process, right? You have to control the aperture of your mouth, you have to control the vocal cords. All of these things work in conjunction in order to produce the desired sounds. So you can lose that ability if you have damage to this area. This here is very important. What is our most important sense? What is our most important sense? Well, it's sight. And we can tell it's our most important sense because we devote the largest amount of brain real estate to that sense. The occipital lobe here is where the nerve impulses from your eye are received and turned into images. We spend a lot of brain power on our visual field, our visual acuity. Don't get me wrong, we don't have the best sight in the animal kingdom, but we do have a lot of aspects to our sight that you don't find in many other animals. You know, full color vision, fairly strong visual acuity. Our eyesight's not bad. It's not great. It's not like a hawk or an eagle, but we have an excellent ability to detect moving objects, things like that. Insular lobe. This is located under the other four lobes. You kind of got to dig into the brain a bit to see it. And the key, this lobe does have many different functions, but the key one is going to be your ability to have a sense of self, kind of that introspective awareness, as well as emotional awareness. It's involved in emotional control as well. If we look at addicts when they're like craving drugs, we find that that part of the brain in the insular lobe lights up when they're having those cravings. So it has a role to play in addiction as well. Now, if we were to take the brain and cut it right at the corpus callosum, the part of your brain that joins your left and right hemisphere. Yes, your brain is divided into two different hemispheres. And if we were to cut it at that point, you would be looking at your brain like this, right? So this is the sagittal cross section. So cut the corpus callosum, we peel the brain open, and we can see either hemisphere. Now, this right here is your cerebellum, often called the little brain, and this structure is involved in movement, posture, and balance. Now, if we look at professional athletes, a lot of professional athletes, let's say like a golfer, for example, they can visualize what they're going to do before they do it, right? They will visualize that swing in their mind, and we find that that visualization activates the exact same pathway as when they perform that action. So has a very important role to play in control of your body. It may also have a role to play in learning. People that have that part of their brain damaged often have more challenges with learning. Now, right on top of your brain stem, which is this thing in blue right here, brain stem is often called the primitive brain, we have this area which contains your hypothalamus, your pituitary gland, and your thalamus. Those are all the main hormone secreting parts of the brain, right? Your all the hormones we've learned about pretty much, minus the ones from your kidney, and a couple others. They're going to be secreted from that part of the brain. Now, you also have your pineal gland. Your pineal gland helps to regulate wakefulness, right? It's involved in the sleep cycle. And light, for example, will cause that to start waking yourself up. So how did we wake up back in the day? With the rising of the sun, right? The rising of the sun, optic nerves would take that information, your pineal gland would get activated, and would start to wake you up. Your brain stem, this right here is what connects your brain to the spinal cord. This is kind of like your primitive brain. It's involved in taking care of your basal functions. So the three components are the midbrain. This controls vision, hearing, eye movements, body movements. The pons involved in motor control, sensory analysis, and the medulla, which is involved with your very basal functions, your breathing, your heart beating, things like that. So that is your brain stem, cerebellum. Now, what is it about the brain that allows it to actually do these things, right? How does your brain do these things? Well, just as the nephron was the basic unit of the kidney, the neuron is the basic unit of your brain. Now, these neurons are made up of three different components. You have dendrites, and these dendrites are branch-like extensions of the neuron that receive the impulses and carry them towards the cell body. So here off of our neuron, we have these little branches. Now, there are often axonal terminals, the ends of other neurons, kind of right here on these dendrites, and they will send signals to the dendrites, and then that dendrite will then cause the neuron to fire, and that signal will go down this component here, which is called the axon. Now, your cell body contains your nucleus, contains your organelles of your neuron, and your axon is what actually transmits that signal. So the dendrites receive signals from other neurons. The cell body is kind of what maintains the neuron, has all of your organelles nucleus. It doesn't necessarily need to be where the dendrites are, just FYI. And then your axon here will transmit that nerve signal and send that signal to other neurons, or muscles, or glands. So on your axon, you may have noticed that there's these kind of blue circular things all around it. Now, those are called myelin sheaths. And those myelin sheaths are actually made of fat, right? If you look at your brain has white matter and gray matter. Gray matter is the very thin outer part of the brain, and that's where all of your complex thinking, all those functions I talked about, that happens in the gray matter. The white matter is just a series of effectively fibers that will transfer signals to other parts of the body. And when you're transferring signals to other parts of the body or other parts of the brain, you want it to be as fast as possible, and that's what these myelin sheaths do. Right? The white matter is white because of these myelin sheaths. And this allows something called saltatory conduction, which we'll learn about next class. Its main function is to speed up that nervous signal. Schwann cells are specialized cells which produce that myelin sheath, and between each of your myelin sheaths is what's called a node of Ranvier, and these nodes effectively allow the signal to jump from node to node. So instead of the signal having to go sequentially slowly down the axon, it can jump really quickly from node to node. So again, here you can see these little gaps. These are your nodes of Ranvier, and your signal can jump from gap to gap as a result. And here you have your little Schwann cells. They're responsible for maintaining that myelin sheath. Keep in mind, fat, the myelin sheath, it is a very good insulator, and thus that, because how do our nerves fire? It's actually an electric signal, chemical electric gradient, which we'll learn all about. And fat is an excellent insulator, which can cause that signal, that electrical signal, to have to jump from node to node, because it's insulating against that change in electrical potential. Now, the myelin sheath gives the axon that white appearance, hence the white matter of your brain. And the absence of myelin in the absence of myelin in the brain is what gives you that gray matter, its gray appearance. So that gray matter, where all of your complex thinking, all that other stuff happens, we don't need that signal to be sped up to that same degree. So how do neurons transmit their signals? It's done by electrochemical gradients within the brain. We take advantage of setting up a difference in charge as well as a difference in concentration, and we take advantage of those gradients in order to send signals down your axon. Now, unlike most other cells in the body, neurons are amitotic, meaning they cannot divide or reproduce. We're starting to learn that, well, maybe we can get more brain cells to form. Maybe if we take advantage of stem cells, inject them into the brain, maybe there is some capability to regenerate. But as it stands right now, what you got is what you got. Now, in the case of brain damage, we find people can make pretty remarkable recoveries. But that's mainly because your existing neurons will form more connections. You're not necessarily getting new brain cells. Now, the three types of neurons are your sensory neurons, your interneurons, and your motor neurons. Pretty straightforward, it's kind of in the name. Sensory neurons are obviously involved with your senses. Interneurons will often transmit signals from one place to another. For example, a sensory neuron sends a signal to an interneuron, which will take that signal from wherever. Let's say it's my finger touching a hot element. Take that signal, send it. Maybe that's not the best example because that will cause a reflex arc where it'll just go to my spinal cord, right? And then back to my finger. But let's say something else. Let's say I touch something and my finger is saying, okay, there's pressure here. You're touching something. So that signal will go to the interneuron and that interneuron will carry it all the way to my brain to be processed. And your brain, by the way, is composed of interneurons as well. So all of those nervous cells in your brain, they are interneurons as well. And then lastly, you have motor neurons, which are obviously motor. They are involved in movement. Sensory neurons carries impulses from the body sense to the spinal cord and brain. Example, pain receptors in the skin will send signals to the central nervous system, to the spinal cord, and then to the brain. Now, interneurons are found within the brain and spinal cord. An interneuron acts as links between sensory neurons and motor neurons. Right? If I was touching something hot, well, that signal would go from the sensory neuron to the interneuron in my spine, and then back to the muscles in my arm to retract my hand. And it also receives information from other interneurons and from sensory neurons, right? You have that mesh of interneurons in your brain. So obviously they're sending signals from interneuron to interneuron very, very often. Lastly is motor neurons. This carries the impulse away from the brain and spinal cord to the muscle or the gland. So next class we will be talking all about nerve impulses, how they happen, how exactly does your cell set up this electrochemical gradient, and why is it that a large chunk of ATP in your body is used to set this up. Right? There's one pump in particular that we learned about in the very first unit that chews up a lot of your body's energy expenditure. Right on. Have a wonderful day, everyone.